Heroic fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy which chronicles the tales of heroes in fantasy settings. Characteristics: frequently, the protagonist is reluctant to be a champion or is of low humble origin, and may have royal ancestors as parents but does not know it. Though events are usually beyond the control, they are thrust into positions of great responsibility where the mettle is tested in a number of spiritual and physical challenges. Although it shares many of the basic themes of sword and sorcery, the term heroic fantasy is often used to avoid the garish overtones of the former. History: 19th and 20th century. Initially undistinguished from the other early fantasies of the 19th and 20th centuries, pulp writer Robert E. Howard wrote short stories about a barbarian hero named Conan with tales of fantastic adventure with a king-size dose of the supernatural. Other writers of note added to the still unnamed genre: William Morris, Edson, Evangeline Walton, T. H. White and C.S. Lewis. Heroic fantasy as a genre began to codify and accrue genre conventions following the upsurge of popularity of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which led to an increase in popularity of fantasy fiction in general. The scholarship of writers and editors Lin Carter and Amp L. Sprague de Camp also exerted vast influence on the Robert E. Howard unfinished Conan stories. Carter, as editor of the Ballantine adult fantasy line, in effect created a literary canon of significant fantasy works which, though it included the works of pulp writers Robert E. Howard and H. P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, included other writers not working in that tradition. Carter restored writers such as Edison and Walton from obscurity. For the 1970s onwards, a number of authors began publishing longer, sometimes formulaic, fantasy works and capitalized on the market that the success of Tolkien's work had shown existed. Despite being a science fiction masterpiece, the Star Wars films exerted a considerable metaphor of heroic fantasy. At the same time, sword and sorcery underwent a short resurgence. Michael Moorcock, a sharp critic of Tolkien and his school, which he considered inherently politically conservative, took pains to distance himself from it. 21st century. Many new authors now shed, at least partly, the traditional concepts of heroes and even of good and evil. They tend, like George R. Martin, Robert Jordan, or Robin Hobb, to use several viewpoints of heroes or villains, and to blur the distinction between those two categories. Jacqueline Carey has, in her The Sundering Duology, portrayed an evil god and his army as the protagonists. She shows them not as inherently evil, but as the victims of betrayal and bad choices. On the other hand, the good side are shown as arrogant, narrow-minded, and unforgiving. In other words, there is not much difference between the two sides. Even the evil god has been forced into the role, not by fate, but because of his brother's pride. Another one of Carey's protagonists, Phaedra, is a virtuous and strong young woman who happens to be a masochistic courtesan. Martin has offered a revisionist presentation of the usual heroes, such as the chivalric knight, by showing some as murderers, bullies, and rapists. Some kings and regents are uncaring manipulators, while a few struggle to be decent while fulfilling a greater duty. Powerless commoners, who struggle to survive during a civil war that does not concern them, are often as brutal as their overlords, but are sometimes heroic. A popular example of self-parodying heroic fantasy is provided by the British writer Terry Pratchett, whose parodies of the genre are widely acknowledged as a prime example of British humour. In recent years, heroic fantasy has matured somewhat out of its staid image as subpar fat fantasy, becoming a genre of its own, the best examples of which have received much praise. Selected authors: Fritz Leiber, David Gemmell, Patrick Rothfuss, E. R. Edson, Jessica Amanda Salmonson, Charles R. Saunders, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Carl Edward Wagner, Michael Moorcock, Robert E. Howard, Robert Jordan, Richard Adams, Jacqueline Carey, Mercedes Lackey, Lloyd Alexander, Christopher Paolini, Terry Goodkind, Joe Abercrombie, R.A. Salvatore, Brandon Sanderson, David C. Smith, Richard L. Tierney, Janet Morris, Chris Morris, Joe Bonadonna, Ted T. C. Ripple. Quotations. Heroic fantasy is the name I have given to a subgenre of fiction, otherwise called the sword and sorcery story. It is a story of action and adventure laid in a more or less imaginary world, where magic works and where modern science and technology have not yet been discovered. The setting may be this Earth as it is conceived to have been long ago, or as it will be in the remote future, or it may be another planet or another dimension. Such a story combines the color and dash of the historical costume romance with the atavistic supernatural thrills of the weird, occult, or ghost story. When well done, it provides the purest fun of fiction of any kind. It is escape fiction wherein one escapes clear out of the real world into one where all men are strong, all women beautiful, all life adventurous, and all problems simple, and nobody even mentions the income tax of the dropout problem, a socialized medicine. L. Sprague de Camp. Introduction to the 1967 Ace edition of Conan.